Okay, let's jump right into this explainer. Today, we are tracing a massive, totally fascinating thematic bridge across history. We're going to look at how our everyday urge to just buy stuff literally reshaped the global economy, triggered massive geopolitical conflicts, and completely transformed society across two wildly different eras. We usually think of history as this series of decisions made by kings, presidents, or generals, right? But what if the real driving force was something much more familiar? What if the modern world was actually built by the unstoppable engine of the everyday shopper? To figure this out, we've got a five-part roadmap. We'll hit forging a global economy, the power of consumer demand, the post-war American dream, Cold War and global power, and finally, the fight for civil rights. Let's kick things off with part one, forging a global economy from 1500 to 1800. We're looking at how the Americas were initially forged as a massive, critical cog in a brand new global machine. There's actually a huge paradigm shift in how we view history here. For a long time, we looked at things through the lens of mercantilism. Empires playing a giant game of risk, hoarding wealth, and fighting over sea lanes. But the modern view is way more dynamic. It's called the Atlantic world paradigm, and it completely flips the script. It wasn't just royals making decisions from up high, it was everyday coastal inhabitants and their intense marketplace desires that created a truly global economy. People just wanted things they couldn't get locally, and that simple desire started connecting continents. Before familiar items like sugar or tobacco took over, the very first major link in this global chain was actually silver. And we're talking a mind-boggling scale here. The Spanish forced indigenous people to mine precious ore in places like Potosi in South America, shipping over 50 tons of silver across the ocean every single year. Why? To feed an absolutely insatiable demand from China, which needed all that silver to expand its currency system. Suddenly, America is supplying the bullion to pay for highly sought-after Asian goods. The world is officially connected. Moving into part two, the power of consumer demand and the Atlantic groceries boom. Let's see how this builds into the agricultural machine that truly birthed the Atlantic world. This is where we see the rise of what people back then just called groceries. Tropical dietary items and energizers like tobacco, sugar, coffee, and cocoa. With all that vast land in the Americas, the supply was definitely there. But keeping up with Europe's massive hunger for these goods came at an incredibly dark and profound cost. To fuel this consumer engine, colonial powers relied on the transatlantic slave trade. Enslaved migrants from Africa were forced into labor, driving the enormous spread of the plantation complex, all just to satisfy a sudden craving for what were at the time basically just luxury items. To really wrap your head around this, look at the sheer scale of the behavior. By the late 17th century, a staggering 85% of the value of all imports rolling into London from the American colonies was just tobacco and sugar products. 85%. The vast majority of a global empire's trade value was tied up in everyday habits like sweetening a cup of tea or smoking a pipe. It completely rewired the dietary habits of the world and concentrated unimaginable wealth. And it's exactly that consumer-first mindset that actually sparked the American Revolution. We all know the phrase, no taxation without representation, but think about the actual chain of events. These colonists were massive consumers of British goods. So when the empire tried to slap heavy taxes on sugar and tea, the colonists didn't just react as subjects, they reacted as shoppers. They organized massive boycotts and non-importation pledges to protect the market principles of supply and demand from heavy-handed state meddling. Their identity as consumers was quite literally the catalyst for the Declaration of Independence. Jumping ahead to part three, the post-war American dream, 1945 to 1964. We're entering a totally different era, where America isn't just supplying the goods anymore, it becomes the ultimate high-mass consumption society itself. The growth here is just off the charts. Between 1945 and 1960, right after World War II, the American gross national product skyrocketed by an incredible 250%. This explosion of wealth lifted 60% of the population into a rapidly expanding middle class. Suddenly, everyday folks were enjoying a standard of living that used to be strictly reserved for the super rich. Flush with cash and savings from wartime work, people went on a serious spending spree. By 1960, 87% of families had a television, 75% had a car, and 75% owned a washing machine. This wasn't just casual shopping. This was a voracious demand for labor-saving appliances that permanently transformed how an entire household functioned. And that exact economic engine built the modern American suburb. Think about places like Levittown, New York. Developers completely standardized construction to keep up with this insane housing demand. They were offering brand new houses for just $1,000 down and $70 a month. The total price tag? A mere $10,000. Combine that with the GI Bill's low-interest mortgages, and suddenly, the idyllic American dream was totally accessible to millions of returning vets and their new families. Sociologist George Katona really hit the nail on the head regarding this era's optimism. He noted that minimum standards of living were finally assured for the majority, and that the broad masses were the ones generating most of the demand. Millions of blue-collar workers finally had paid vacations, 40-hour work weeks, and real upward mobility. Their massive demand for homes and cars was the very engine generating the nation's incredible wealth. Which brings us to part 4, Cold War and global power. Because this booming domestic prosperity, it definitely wasn't happening in a vacuum. It was paralleled by intense geopolitical tension as the world split into two deeply opposed camps. Instead of launching into a direct military conflict with the Soviet Union, the US leaned into a strategy called containment. It was basically a giant waiting game. The goal was to halt communist expansion globally and just wait out the Soviet system. The US bet that the totalitarian system was too inefficient compared to booming capitalist consumer markets, and that it would eventually collapse from internal weakness, without the world having to endure a catastrophic hot war. But that strategy still led to a rapid, terrifying escalation. We're talking proxy wars like Korea in 1950 and fierce technological races kicking off with the Soviet launch of Sputnik in '57. And of course, all this tension climaxed in the 1962 Cuban Missile Crisis, a totally nerve-wracking 13-day standoff that is still the closest the Cold War ever came to a civilization-ending nuclear exchange. Finally, we reach part 5, the fight for civil rights. To fully understand this era, we really have to contrast that affluent post-war boom with the deep systemic inequalities that persisted right at home. While millions of people were living it up in the middle class, this era was also defined by incredibly stark racial disparities. Just looking at 1947, 60% of Black families lived below the poverty level, compared to 23% of white families. It's a harsh data point that makes one thing very clear. This post-war economic miracle completely bypassed huge segments of the American population. You end up with this glaring juxtaposition. On one hand, you've got the idyllic suburban dream, high mass consumption, brand new cars, and comfortable tract homes. On the other hand, you have what got labeled the other America, neighborhoods facing persistent poverty, brutal Jim Crow segregation laws in the South, and heavily restricted voting rights. That massive disconnect is exactly what prompted a grassroots push to force real change. And the response was absolutely undeniable. Led by groups like the NAACP and figures like Martin Luther King Jr., African Americans utilized nonviolent direct action. From outlawing segregated schools in 1954's Brown v. Board of Education to the iconic 1963 March on Washington, they used the newly widespread national television coverage to hold a mirror up to the country. Through incredibly brave grassroots boycotts, sit-ins, and freedom rides, they systematically fought to secure their basic constitutional rights. So, as we wrap up this explainer, I want to leave you with this thought. We've seen how, from that 18th century hunger for sugar to the 20th century rush for suburban homes, consumer demand undeniably fueled global power, massive innovation, and unprecedented wealth. It literally built the modern world. But when we look back at the enslaved laborers of the Atlantic world and the marginalized communities left out of the post-war boom, we have to ask, who truly paid the price for that engine of demand? It's a complex legacy, but understanding these dual realities is absolutely crucial for making sense of the world we're living in today. Thanks so much for joining me, and keep asking the big questions.